Bonjour,
Good afternoon and welcome to this new session of Ex-en-Scène Economic Talks. I am Leonardo Martinelli. I'm an Italian journalist working with La Stampa. I will moderate this session about low interest rates to preserve a debt-ridden economy. I'll immediately present the speakers in the order that we will hear them. We have Catherine Luboshinsky, who's an economist, teaches at Paris 2 Panthéon-Assas University. She represents the Cercle des économistes for this section, and she will set the background for the debate. Next, we will hear Lorenzo BINI SMAGHI, who's from Florence, which is important for a banker. You are the chairman of Société Générale, one of the largest European banks. You've been there since 2015. You were previously member of the board of the European Central Bank between 2005 and 2011. So it was a troubled period, especially for interest rates and debt. Next, we will hear from Philippe VIDAL, who's here with me. You're Deputy Chief Executive Officer of CIC Bank. You joined the group in 1993. CIC is a bank that is deeply rooted in local territories in France, headed by Crédit Mutuel. I also have Kako NUBUKPO, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Management of Lome in Togo. Previously, you were Minister of Prospective and Public Policy Assessment in Togo from 2013 to 2015. And you work about the operation of the CFA franc and the transition towards the future currency, ECO. Remotely from England, we will later hear Jagjit CHADHA. You are an economist. You're the director of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, which is an independent research institution, one of the oldest in the UK. You were also professor of economics in Kent and Cambridge universities. And to conclude, we will hear remotely, from Olivier KLEIN. Since 2012, Mr. KLEIN has been Director General of BRED, the largest commercial bank of the PPCE group, that includes Banque Populaire and Caisse d'Épargne. Now, let us start by hearing Catherine Luboshinsky. Good afternoon, everybody. Extremely low interest rates, yes. A graph was presented by Aldan in 2015, showed that interest rates had never been so low in the past 5,000 years. That's a little background. On the recent time, no doubt, nominal rates are at a very low level, since they're even negative. Long rates minus short rates and long rates minus 0.13% for the long term. So we have more than 11 trillion public and private debt with negative yield. That's never seen before. And most of these negative rates are distributed between Europe and Japan, not so much in the US. So, but the picture is not as clear as if we look at real interest rates, taking into account inflation. There were other periods where real interest rates were negative at the end of the 70s, early 80s, when the central bank rates were very high. We all know that there was a lot of inflation following to oil shocks, and during those periods we had very low or even negative real interest rates. Then there was a decrease in real interest rates that went down to 4%. So they decreased and consistently linked in relation with the potential growth rate of Western culture, Western economies, 1.5% in France. Why? Well, because there's a low productivity of factor, low growth in capital stock. So since the beginning of the year 2000, the determination of the level of long nominal rates reflects a new dynamic. Short rates are still subjected to the rate of central banks, but the long that depended on anticipated reaction risk premiums depend mostly from quantitative effects that emerge with the major unbalances of current accounts at the turn of the century. And despite a hike of rates by the Fed in 2004, the long rates had not moved. Greenspan had said that we were faced to a long-term interest rate conundrum. Since the crisis of 2008, there were non-conventional monetary policies with massive purchases of public debt. Then here again, we have quantitative effects that explain the level of long rates. We have a flattening of the curve, and governments and some corporations borrow at negative rates. So this extremely low interest rate level should continue. So that seems like a good idea, at least for those who are in debt. And the most indebted economic agent is the government. So the 2007 crisis had cost an additional 20 points for the ratio of debt on PIB, on GDP. The COVID crisis will have more or less the same effect. So the major concern is about public debt sustainability. In Japan, this ratio is 240% of GDP. So we could, at first sight, say, well, there's no reason to worry if it's 150. But let's not forget that the sovereign debt crisis started in 2010-11 with Greek debt at around 120% of GDP, which is the area that we are going to reach now. So the problem of sustainability is not really understandable through this ratio, which is flow out of stock. There are other factors. There's debt service, and the weight of non-resident investors, so the structure of investors. Debt dynamics depends on the gap between growth rate and interest rate. So even if you have balanced budget, if you have interest rate that's above the growth rate, you can have a deterioration of debt rate. The example is Greece, that had lost a fourth of its GDP in a few years, and despite moderately high rates, despite restructurations, the debt on GDP rate had increased. So we have to look at the gap between growth rate and interest rate. Second, the cost of financing this debt, which is an essential element of solvency. Despite the increase of public debt, the cost of interest paid has sharply diminished since 2007. Between 2007 and 2019, in the EU, the amount of interest paid have diminished by 80 billion, including 15 billion for France only. This is partly due to the decrease in rates, an improvement in solvency. Finally, we are seeing that sovereign debt crises are very often triggered by non-resident investors that react or tend to overreact. So that's one of the arguments used to explain why Japan, despite its high indebtedness, didn't face such a crisis. increased holding of public debt by central banks will reduce the probability of a new sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone. It's a different story for Africa because of external dependency. And to conclude, now is the time for governments to invest massively on fields, on the areas for the future, such as education, climate, health, and so on. I apologize, that are very important for future growth or potential future growth. Thank you, Catherine LUBOCHINSKY. I will now hand over to Lorenzo BINI SMAGHI, who's with us remotely. We will hear about each speaker for about 6 minutes for this first round. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I would like to compliment Catherine's presentation by adding another dimension in addition to the analysis that was proposed. If you add to the flow, indebtedness and interest rate and growth, which she mentioned, I would like to add the stock dimension, which is the absolute, the amount of debt in absolute terms. If we look at the other side of the debt, what do we have? There's someone who holds the debt, not just the one who takes on the debt, but there's the creditor. And the creditor believes that this debt instrument that he's holding, public or private, is a way to invest their resources. So on one side of the stick, there's debt, and on the other side, it's wealth or it's resource assets. So if we consider that the balance between demand and supply of debt is established at such a low interest rate, that could be because there's not enough debt. And this could be the paradoxical situation that we are living now. Global wealth has increased because savings rate throughout the world by individuals and corporations, which is new. People are putting money on the side. And the other aspect is a preference for liquidity, a preference for instruments that are safer, that do not bear too much risk. This increase in wealth in relation to the production of each country, and same at global level, creates a demand for low-risk financial assets. And this demand that has increased throughout the world it goes through government securities from the US, Japan, and Europe. And these savings at global level has a very low interest rate. On the other hand, riskier assets have more unstable interest rates. The consequence is that, in my view, we're going to see this situation continue for a fairly long period until this savings rate will change. Now, to prepare for population aging, savings is key, especially in societies that do not have a developed welfare system. So the paradox is that we saw debt increase, indebtedness increase across the board, and at the same time, very low interest rate. So there's a demand for debt in general. So there are two kinds of debt. There's good debt and bad debt, so to speak. The risk is to see bad debt that at one point nobody wants it, interest rate rises, and we have an economic crisis. This is the reason why central banks are buying either good or bad debt because they cannot really select, and they offer liquidity to savers. So we're in a situation when there's a lot of deposits. The next speaker can maybe will qualify what I'm saying, but the banks have huge deposits. And a few years ago, banks wanted more deposits to fund the loans that when they were working at low cost. But today, if you have a large client who comes to your bank with a large deposit, you will tell him, "Oh, please, go to see my competitor," because holding deposits is costly. So there's an extraordinary level of liquidity, very low interest rates, and the more dynamic part of the government, can produce that. But we all want economic policies that encourages people to save, savers to have more risky assets, more equity than bonds. But at global level, we do not have sufficient level of creation to have more growth and more investment throughout the economy. So this unbalance between savings and investment leads to an accumulation of assets or wealth that do not find a very productive use. So we're going to stay in this situation with significant instability because savers, they're not happy with these negative interest rates. They're going to try and come up with alternative investments that are more profitable, that are riskier. And in moments of tension like this one can be dangerous. So investors will massively sell these assets. And there's only central banks who can buy this risk and bear this risk. So in future years, we're going to see a very different situation with very low volatility, but very powerful changes in volatility that will create problems of with savings. That's what I wanted to introduce to stimulate the discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. BINI SMAGHI. I'll hand over to Philippe Vidal. Maybe you can tell us about this excess of deposits.
I do share what he said. So there is low inflation, moderate growth, and there's an excess of savings that is very difficult to invest. And at a time when we are facing an aging population pattern, so central banks injected massive liquidity, massive cash. It was also the case in the past. So in terms of savings, you have lots of deposits. So we could tell our customers with lots of deposits to be put on the accounts, the rates are negative. So if you invest in the central bank at a rate of 0.5%, it's not great, so they should keep their deposits. So it's a paradoxical situation that will go on for some time. So you have excessive savings, but people don't know where to invest savings. They don't want to invest in risky products because they don't trust the future. And you have some financial institutions, they take some long commitments, pension funds, insurance companies do that. So there are some problems of insolvency that could emerge. This is something that we experienced when the interest rates were low. The financial institutions are nonetheless solid. So you may have some asset bubbles, something that we experienced in the past. Of course, this is not something that we've been concerned about indirectly, and when interest rates are low, it means that we can support companies with a low economic performance at the expense of companies that are more active, that perform more, that would invest more, and they are impaired by this competition that is buoyed artificially. But these risks are relegated to a matter of secondary importance versus another risk, a low economy, a sluggish economy that has to pick up. So central banks and governments take the right measures, to save jobs and to save the economy, and they injected cash so that companies could continue to operate and work in So warranted loans were granted to the tune of 80%, more than 100 billion for our group, Crédit Mutuel, with CAC, 17 billion injected. So a massive movement, and maturities were postponed. So cash liquidities, that's not a major problem for banks. But how do we move away from this situation of debts? Of course, households and companies are also facing a high indebtedness. So it was 70% of GDP, now it is 200% of GDP. So how do we move away from that situation? We need to get back to growth. And so some companies are structurally debt strapped. So how should they invest more, and what is their capacity to invest? You should have a solid foundations. Of course, you have cash credits, but they will have to redeem. So equity will have to be injected. So in terms of equity, have in mind capital, but quasi-equity, so debt being injected in the long term. So the banks have developed some tools for long-term operations, and it's a matter of having a long-lasting approach. As part of this business activity, we have to be selective. So, of course, we need to invest in equity to the tune of 2.4 billion in terms of capital. You have lots of debt funds. We manage debt funds, subordinated debts, long-term capital, private equity, and the debt funds are earmarked for small and medium-sized companies. But for the very small companies, I think that we need to take another approach. Participative loans. So they've been in existence in France for quite a long time. These are subordinated loans. So it means that suppliers of companies can be reassured, creditors, the short-term banks, the credit insurers can be reassured. So long-term capital that is being distributed through the bank networks, because the fabric of the small companies are very well known by banks. So we need to think about that with the public authorities. So before the end of the year, we should be in a position to support companies on this equity funds or quasi-equity funds, and the state will have to step in, because it's not only a matter for banks. I would say that there's a sort of groundswell trajectory, and we can see light at the end of a tunnel. Companies and businesses have decided to invest, and they want to play a key role as part of the pickup process, as part of the recovery process. Some companies will contend with some difficulties, but other companies will be well equipped to move away from the crisis, and we need to help them. So I would give the floor now to Monsieur Kako NUBUKPO, who is with us in the studio. So in Africa, the situation is different. The interest rates are high, two-digit figures in terms of interest rates. So this does pose a problem in terms of growth rates and in terms of debt sustainability. So I think that we can have a twofold approach, short-term, mid-term. In the short term, things are very simple. We need to handle the crisis. So we were buffeted by the crisis. So the price of raw materials has decreased. So we've lost half of the export revenues, and the tourism industry has dwindled. There are fewer migrants, and 10% of GDP is due to the flow of migrants. And you can also notice that the business activity has decreased because of lockdown. So what do we do with debt? I mean, this is what is at stake. So we need to think about the moratorium or the potential cancellation of debts, because if you consider interest rates, we cannot benefit from the global effect. When you take into account the currency reserve for the external debt, the ratio is 38%. So we don't have much leeway in terms of debt. So especially if there were to be some speculation-based attacks. So there are two schools of thought. You have to consider that 40% of the African debt belong to private companies, and the debt structure in Africa has changed. And for private companies, they are interested in credibility, in the reputational risk. So if you don't want to redeem debts, so when you back, the risk premium will be high. So the first time ever in Africa, you have some countries such as Rwanda, Benin, they've said explicitly, we want to redeem the debts. We don't want to accept the offer of President Macron. We want to annul, call off the African debt, and this is something that is new. And you have some people with a traditional stance. They will tell you, the cost is $45 billion, the absence of a moratorium. So we, in order to get some budget leeway, we would like to get this moratorium worth $45 billion. So at the end of the day, you have different transmission channels. They are not really well stabilized in Africa. So the post-COVID debate is about international relations, but with the private sector that is being structured alongside the public sector. You had the Club of Paris, bringing together the traditional creditors, France, Germany, Japan, and the debt is worth 6%. So most of the time, we have a debt to China to the tune of 17%, and China is not part and parcel of the Paris Club. So we're not sure that China will play by the rules of the moratorium or debt cancellation. And I think that is very interesting. So this has changed the balance of powers, but there's something that is more important, the midterm. And regarding the midterm, by the way, I'm an African economist, so I'm interested in the structural transformation of African economies. So African debts are back in a recurring fashion, but we don't ask why. What are the reasons why? The tax space is very restricted. So the tax pressure is about 17% in Africa as against 30% in the rest of the world. So there are two challenges at work. Increase in tax yields. African tax administrations should perform better in order to collect taxes. And And I think that the tax area should be expanded, so the ability to increase the African base so we can export our raw materials without any processing. But when you process raw materials, you can create jobs. With jobs, you can get revenues, and with revenues, you can get taxes. And with taxes, with tax collection, states can fund their public spending. And with this crisis, you have the drivers having to do with African emergence. So it has to do with the capability to create wealth, and the objective is to have a social state. So the interest rates are the be-all or the end-all of lots of operations. I will give the floor now to Mr. CHADHA. Mr. CHADHA, so you are with us from the UK. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. I've very much enjoyed listening to everyone this afternoon. There have been some excellent descriptions of the issues that we face. Thank you for allowing a Brit to join you today from Cambridge. I can assure you I'd rather be in Aix with you. I'm a great Francophile, and it's a great chance for me to discuss some of these things with such excellent company this afternoon. The whole issue of low global interest rates is very much to do with the integration of economies in other parts of the world into the world trading system, the advanced set of advanced economies. But a process of around a quarter of a century whereby there have been fast-growing countries, China, Russia, India, Brazil, and large parts of East Asia, that have imposed themselves on the economic structures of the world. And these countries, many of them have been characterized as being very high savers relative to what we tend to do in what we call the West or the advanced economies. So they've brought, as a process of their growth, very large pools of savings into the global capital markets. Now that has two direct effects. One is that as these countries have industrialized and pushed out their productivity processes, they've produced goods and services much more cheaply than we can in the West. This has tend to put downward pressure on real wages compared to what we otherwise might have seen. And it's also tended to put downward pressure on traded goods and services. We notice, for example, many clothes and other traded goods are much cheaper relative to our incomes than they were half a century or 30 years ago. And that, of course, is a good thing. We're doing things more efficiently in other parts of the world. So we're getting cheaper goods, and consumers who are in work are materially better off in the West than they otherwise would have been. But because these countries are saving rather than spending the money domestically on the building of infrastructure or the development of their own domestic firms in the way that we might see in the West, or, as a previous speaker said, the development of the welfare state, which we did in Europe immediately after World War II, these pools of savings, as we all know, have been recycled through the financial systems back into the West. And they've been recycled at very low interest rates. So we tend to think in economics, when the prices of something are lower, we tend to want more of them. And that's exactly what we've done with debt. So the Western economies have taken on more debt, both at the public, the household, and the firm level. The UK has got almost 100% of income, 100% of GDP as debt in each of those three categories. And that is the root cause of the financial crisis, recycling those bits of capital to bits of the economy that necessarily couldn't absorb all that capital in the way and lead to productive outcomes that would have led it to be paid off. Financial crisis, I think, was heroically sorted out by the response of central banks and ministries of finance to stop that becoming an absolute depression for a long time. But the response was a prolonged period of low further interest rates to help the economies try to recover. Now, to be clear, the counterfactual would have been much worse. If central banks hadn't come to the rescue in 2008-9, we would have had a much worse outcome for the advanced economies than they otherwise would have had. But the extraordinary policies, the development of balance sheet policies, all of which have been designed to lower long-term interest rates and reduce term premia, have acted to keep interest rates low for a very long time subsequently. There's further pressure on that as well. in the terms of both regulatory reasons to hold government debt, have also put downward pressure on those long-term interest rates, as well as, fundamentally, there's a shortage of risk-free assets in the world. So people continue to buy government debt and hold the prices down. So where does that leave us? Well, there's an old British saying, in fact, it's from Yorkshire, and it goes something like, I wouldn't have started from here if I were you. And this is the problem we find ourselves in. Having not properly integrated the financial circulation of capital into our economies, we found that what we've done is just absorb a lot of debt. And yet we find ourselves with very low interest rates. And this leaves the financial sector in a quandary. Can it, at low interest rates, reallocate capital to more productive firms and lead to the prosperity that we want? Or will that capital stay with firms who have already taken on large amounts of debt and cannot invest in the way they would want to do because they're carrying very large amounts of debt? Or if the private sector and the banks cannot work that out, do we then have to turn to the state? Do we say, well, none of us can, in the private sector, increase prosperity by cycling capital to the more new productive firms because of the debt that we've got as an overhang? So we need to turn to the state. The state will have to borrow and invest either in infrastructure or take an interest in firms to develop prosperity. And that's where I start to worry. The state is very good at dealing with market failures and the provision of public goods, but the state is not always that good at picking economic, industrial and other winners. And I do believe ultimately that's the function of the banking system and the system of financial intermediation. So we have to pay very careful attention to how we weave our way out of what is a very risky situation for the advanced economies in the world. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur CHADHA. Et ces premiers tours de table,
Thank you, Mr. CHADHA. Mr. KLEIN, you can conclude the first cycle of this round table. I'm a professor of monetary policy at HEC. It's a business school. So just to tell you that we have a title, Low Interest Rates to Preserve an Indebted Economy. And yes, but we have to be careful because we might be on a collision course when there's a financial economic crisis, when it is quite serious, and when you have short-term interest rates when they are close to zero, and when you are indebted, central banks will use negative interest rates, especially in Europe. And they've used quantitative easing in order to control long-term rates and to control the debt spreads. Then this has an impact on demand, this has an impact on worth assets, and this will buoy demand. So the monetary policy and the non-conventional monetary policy has an objective, i.e. to cut nominal interest rates below the nominal growth rate. And in so doing, it's possible to kickstart the economy. It means that debt can be redeemed more easily versus a fully fledged debt situation. So reimbursing debt is easier when you have nominal interest rates that are low. So what is the danger lurking? We might be facing a series of significant problems when the use of the monetary policy is asymmetric. What do I mean by that? When we are faced with a serious crisis, the short-term rates would be decreased, advocated by the central banks, the spreads, the risk premium are dwindled, and these are the non-conventional new monetary policies. So that's good because central banks have decided to move to these kinds of policies, but there's an asymmetry because when you have growth that comes back, as it was the case in 2016 and 2017 in the Eurozone, very often interest rates don't go up, or they barely go up, and quantitative easing doesn't diminish. So what was the reason for that? In the Eurozone, the inflation rate was too low, but maybe inflation is structurally too low, and maybe a monetary policy could help rise this interest rates, but it means that the interest rates will be below the growth rates for quite a long time. And we don't want to have low interest rates for too long, too low interest rates for too long. So when the interest rates are below the growth rate, this might induce a return of the financial cycle. So it means that indebtedness will increase, and in fact, you end up with indebted bubbles, or with indebtedness you can buy assets, and in fact this will fuel bubbles. So the economies will be financially vulnerable. So there are risks in the balance sheets that have gone up for savers, for investors. They want to get some yields, and the risk premium are very low, and that's quite abnormal. So they want to get a bit of yield, and the risk premium will be squeezed, and that's quite dangerous, because when the bubble bursts, risk premium won't have hedged the cost of risk, and it means that assets are vulnerable. So the assets of financial investors, assets of savers working for pension funds, for insurance companies, investment funds, they all have vulnerable assets. Regarding borrowers, they borrow too much in those conditions, and liabilities are vulnerable to curtailment in cash flow, to a decline in growth, or an increase in interest rates. Regarding financial vulnerability, you have induced problems. There are some companies that shouldn't be there, but they are still there at a time when they are not profitable, and they would go bankrupt even with mainstream interest rates. So it means that the economy is less efficient, and productivity gains are fewer. So low interest rates for quite a long time, it's not good, and you have to consider that there might be a financial crisis, a financial instability, and the economy won't be efficient because productivity gains are curtailed. So with COVID-19, production has dwindled significantly together with the cash flows. So the financial situation was disastrous at the start. The pre-COVID situation was quite vulnerable, and the central banks provided a good answer. So the financial crisis triggered by COVID was much more acute than in 2009, with volatility of shares that was high, spreads that went in a bad patch, but the central banks managed to dwindle or to reduce their rates. Not in the US, because the rates were negative, and they started to buy public and private debt, and they bought high-yield instruments, and they even bought shares, and they launched macroprudential measures. So in 15 days, it was possible to mitigate a financial situation. And I will finish with that, but how will we move away from this crisis? I'm putting I tend to anticipate, too much, to put the cart before the horse, but we need to think about the end of a crisis. So in 18 months, in 24 months, I hope. So how will we move away from this situation? First of all, it will be a slow process, a gradual process, but the situation won't be an easy one, because after the crisis, we've noticed that companies were strapped by debts. And they had to fund their debts, and states are over-indebted, and there will be some bubbles. There are some bubbles on the net worth assets, both for the property industry and shares. So if we increase the rates, and if there's a progressive withdrawal of quantitative easing, so there might be a problem for public and private insolvency. So, and if inflation is back in 2 or 3 years' time, it would be a genuine problem for the central banks. So, of course, central banks need to think about their policies. It's important to have a sustainable budget policy in the midterm. It's not a matter of bringing about austerity measures, but we need to build up a sustainable budget policy. It's important to revamp some economies, i.e. it's important to embark upon structural reforms in order to reduce the debt burden. There should be some policies designed to favor the corporate capital. I do agree with Philippe Vidal. There should be more investments in equity and participative loans, but they will have to be helped because French people do not allocate their savings to these funds. So for the central banks, in order to avoid a violent crisis, a dangerous crisis in the future, we have to take care about fiscal dominance. And we need to be careful with the financial bank dominance. The market shouldn't be dominated by the financial markets, and the financial markets want to get money injected in order to support themselves. So if we have this kind of dominance with central banks, it would be a problem. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Klein. So,
Catherine LUBOCHINSKY, you gave us a historical background before, the situation in 2007, 2008. And situation now, we have a similar situation with very low interest rate, running debt. Do you believe that there was more or less risk now than at that time, especially in terms of public debt sustainability? And I'll ask the same question to BINI SMAGHI, who was a key player then, as he is now, and who was a member of the board of NUBUKPO. Well, first, the main difference between those two crises is that the 2007 was a financial crisis with economic impact, whereas now we have a health crisis with economic impact and possibly financial impact, which we want to avoid. However, the situation of financial institutions is entirely different thanks to change in regulation. Now banks were recapitalized and are better equipped to face a possibly increase in default rates. So the situation is not entirely the same. However, the resources implemented by governments are much more substantial over a much shorter period. So it was a much faster response. It is very important for governments to target spending very well, make a significant effort in terms of budget spending efficiency, and also take advantage of this window of opportunity when rates are extremely low. And indeed, the situation cannot prevail for 10, 30 years. But we should take the opportunity of this time to possibly extend the average duration or maturity of public debt. That's very surprising, because between 2007 and now, there's only an increase of only 1 year of the average maturity of public debt. It went up from 7 to 8 years. In the US, it's even lower. At the same time, we hear people who are proposing that government issue perpetual bonds. It's a big joke. If you find zero coupon perpetual bonds, if you find investors, tell me, send them to me. Yeah, are you more concerned this time around than in the previous crisis? And Catherine, do you believe that, well, the reason why this response was faster is that we have learned our lessons from the previous experience? Yes, indeed. The banking system, for example, is now part of the solution rather than the trigger of the crisis in 2008, especially in the US. We have a banking system that is better balanced. The problem in Europe is that we do not have a capital market that's sufficiently developed in Europe to support companies and to help them have better access to risk capital, which is what we need to have more balanced growth. I believe that the main problem hasn't changed over the past 10 years, is that the solution to all this is not a monetary one. However, monetary policy jumps in when the other policy areas are not doing their job. They cannot succeed sometimes for political reasons. They cannot find the solution. Let me take a provocative example. This is pretty politically incorrect. I was talking about the increase in saving, which is partly due to population aging, and it's partly due to the fact that we live longer lives, but retirement age has not changed. If we are in retirement for a longer period and our contributions are unchanged, we either have to reduce pensions or push retirement age at a later time. Unless this is done, the trend would be an increase in saving. People will increase their savings, and this increase in savings leads to a reduction in interest rates. And where are the saving going to go? Well, when you are close to retirement age, you want to put your savings in low-risk instruments, such as government bonds. This is why government bonds have negative yield. There's too much demand for low-risk securities. If we want to change this, push savings towards more risk and more investment, we would need to take strong measures in terms of tax measures and also in terms of retirement age. We see that politically it cannot be done. So we would need structural change. You were talking about structural change, the need for structural change in Africa, but in Europe we also have a strong need to make our economic systems more resilient, more well-adjusted to aging population. And it's because politicians are not able to do this. Monetary policy, it befalls on monetary policy to do it. But we're only buying time. We're not avoiding the risk for potential instability down the line. There are quite a few questions from our listeners. One, I think, would be good for Philippe Vidal. With these low risks over a long time, how can the bank, since the cost of risk will increase due to the crisis, will the banks be enough resilient, or do we need to reinvent models? As I said before, the solidity of banks now has nothing to see with what it was in 2008. Equity has been, or capital is multiplied by 2. But it's more difficult to make money with intermediation when in a negative or low interest rate environment. When we do have deposits, but we're placing them to investing it in the central bank at a loss, and it's difficult to make money when there's a lot of money. So it's a model of revenue diversification that we absolutely need. We're more of a service provider. We're still a bank, but we're not just a bank. We're also an insurer, and we also sell plenty of services. We have an agreement with Bouygues Telecom to develop, as we have done in the past 15 years, phone-based banks for the network. So we do also different services, and this is our solution to develop new revenue streams to benefit our members and our clients that still have a strong interest to stay with our teams to benefit from their advice. So the model has changed. The crisis revealed this, since we are and we will be in the foreseeable future in a low interest rate environment, but we need to move a little faster in this effort to reorganize our teams. Digital technologies have taken a considerable place, both in purchasing and also with our clients. So this had been rampant, but it's now obvious now, and it would change our network. And yes, maybe value commissions over spreads. Yes, and value a real service, relevant service, and advice. People are using online banking increasingly. Our banks were open during this period, even though they were closed, but our teams granted more than 100,000 loans while working from home, most of them. So we can be close to the client and far from them. We're not using Zoom for security reasons, but we have reinvented the way we operated. Thank you. Your presentation was very interesting because it projects us onto an entirely different context in terms of interest rates. You mentioned China. China is a very important player. Can you tell us more on that? Indeed. What's going on in Africa currently is very interesting. We have 4 challenges that together. There's the demographic challenge. Our population is doubling every 25 years. We have 40% of the population is under 15. So you imagine what demand in terms of education, training, jobs that this means. There's the environmental challenge. That's a global challenge. We have the security challenge. And above all, we have the challenge of inequality. So based on what the previous speaker said, we can see that a cooperation policy can emerge to recycle saving, because there is a very strong need for investment in the South, especially in Africa. So on major investment, the Western countries did not really play their role. They left empty space, and China took over all the field of infrastructure. But the problem is that debt to China is not at concessional rate. The interest rate is not at market rates. So we are indebted at commercial interest rates. The problem now, beyond short-term negotiations with the Paris Club, since China is not a member but an observer at the Paris Club, the thing we have to do is the financial development of Africa. How can we create a financial space that is a high performance, that in order to recycle saving and reduces capital volatility, because we are losing 50 billion each year in capital. So the problem with China that is going to develop in the next 50 years is how is the world going to support Africa in their development? Because there will be a population of 2 billion by 2050. So the development of Africa will be key for the planet's stability. Thank you. I have a question for Jagjit CHADHA, who's listened to us from the UK. You ended your presentation by calling, if I understood well, for increasing the role of governments. Governments should be investors. Is that what you meant? Or can you maybe expand on this? Or that was the end of what you said here?
You know exactly what I wanted to expand upon, if I may, in the next minute or two. I think first, if I could just say, we certainly need to move away from a world in which we treat the central bank as the only game in town. Central banks can provide space in financial markets and stability in financial markets. But the dynamism of the economy is to do with firms and to do with the way that the state sets the provision of public goods, education, infrastructure, broadband, digitization, defense, all these things. And so I think one thing we haven't set properly, it seems to me, in the post-financial crisis period and in the post-digitization period, is thinking what is the exact role of the state vis-a-vis the private sector. Because of the low level of interest rates, which I think is going to persist for some time, I'm not terribly worried immediately about the levels of public debt. And indeed, in the UK, the maturity of debt is on average actually 15 years, I think the highest in the advanced world. So we're not having the rollover problem in debt that we sometimes see in other economies. It's just not an issue, even though debt is nudging 100% of GDP right now in the UK and in many other countries. The question then is for the politicians to decide what is the role of the state, what kind of things can they do or should they be doing that the private sector cannot do? What does that mean for the level of public debt? And ultimately, what form of tax reform are we going to have to see? In the long epoch of the UK, we've had, after periods of wars in the 19th century, World War I and World War II, when the state increased in size, subsequently, not immediately, the level of tax revenues was raised to meet the underlying budget constraint of the government. Now, we don't have to do it right now. There's a demand for risk-free assets and the interest rate is low. So the state has an opportunity to decide what it needs to do. But to be clear, it doesn't do everything. We still need financial intermediation, the monitoring and screening from the financial sector to ensure that the new ideas and the productive ideas are carried out by firms in the private sector. At some points, it's blurred. It's not quite sure. There is a cogent analysis in some areas in the UK for a development bank, something that would provide long-term funding for firms. I'm not completely convinced that is the right way ahead, but it is a serious discussion we're having. And if I may turn very briefly to the euro area, to the extent that an individual country does not have an independent monetary policy, which the UK is fortunate to have, there will always be more weight on fiscal adjustment to shocks than there will be in a country such as the UK when you've got free reign of monetary policy. To the extent that the policy set by the European Central Bank may not be a perfect fit for any individual country, there will always be more weight required for fiscal policy to adjust. And that requires a rethink of the framework, a rethink of the relationship between the private and the public sector that can lead to prosperity. I think we have a chance. The low interest rate regime gives us that chance, but it requires some very hard thinking in the public sector across the advanced economies. I think it's a really serious issue. I hope that answers your question.
Merci. Merci, Jagjit. Je voulais aussi poser une question à...
Thank you, Jagjit. I also wanted to ask a question to Mr. KLEIN. You mentioned the possibility or the risk of having a bubble. In what sector or sectors could we see that? I would appreciate a brief answer because we're close to the end of our session. Bubbles occur on wealth assets. So there's some risk in stocks and equity, not in all sectors, and real estate, as someone else mentioned, is starting to show very high prices in many areas, not everywhere, of course. So that's where the risks are. And besides, risk premiums are much too low to cover the cost of risk. And on debt, and that's another bubble. There's another question. Maybe we could ask to Mr. BINI SMAGHI in light of his experience with the ECB. That's a question from a listener. What are the risks of continuing low interest rates on the value of the euro in monetary union?
Monnaies importantes sont l'euro, le dollar, le yen. Elles ont toutes plus ou moins des taux d'intérêt bas. Je crois que les investisseurs regardent surtout à la croissance de moyen terme des économies et la soutenabilité de la dette. Et je pense que si dans le court terme, et ceci a été déjà dit par d'autres, Olivier en particulier, ces taux d'intérêt faibles, ces interventions servent pour relancer l'économie. Et pour redonner des perspectives de croissance, l'euro va rester une monnaie solide. Et c'est assez intéressant de voir qu'au fond, entre le dollar et l'euro, ces 4-5 dernières années, le taux de change est resté assez stable, ce qui n'était pas le cas après la crise de 2008-2009. Donc je pense qu'au fond, les politiques monétaires sont assez alignées. La différence vraie viendra des éléments de moyen terme, des éléments structurels qui vont déterminer la différence de croissance entre Europe, États-Unis, Japon, pays émergents.
Il y a une autre question, il y a quand même beaucoup de questions intéressantes d'une autre personne qui est en train de nous écouter. Peut-être vous pouvez répondre, Philippe. Démanteler les monopoles permettrait-il à la fois de créer plus d'actifs financiers et de permettre des gains de productivité?
Alors, de quel
C'est une grosse question quand même. Hein.
Je ne sais pas à quel monopole on fait allusion. Donc, parce qu'aujourd'hui, des monopoles, il y en a quand même assez peu. Donc, les monopoles, progressivement, en tout cas en Europe, ont été démantelés. Donc, même,
au plus général, comme récupérer une efficacité et l'investissement financier quand même. Voilà, parce que c'est ça un peu la question avec des taux d'intérêt bas. C'est quand même un problème pour vous, banquiers.
C'est un problème de trouver, et ça a été dit tout à l'heure, en fait, on a un manque de vrais projets. Donc, parce que si l'argent n'arrive pas à être rémunéré correctement, c'est qu'on ne trouve pas les bons projets. Alors, je ne sais pas s'il fallait les faire en Afrique, mais l'Afrique, c'est aussi à risque. Donc, on en fait avec des clients, voilà. Mais on est toujours assez prudent sur la manière de faire ça. Et je pense que dans les infrastructures, il y a beaucoup de choses à faire. Dans les énergies renouvelables, il y a beaucoup de choses à faire. Donc, il y a beaucoup de projets. Et alors, le thème de l'énergie est un domaine où effectivement les anciens monopoles, plutôt oligopoles, sont en train d'être battus en brèche.
C'est ça.
Donc ça, je pense, c'est deux domaines où effectivement il y a de la matière, il y a de l'investissement, il y a des idées, il y a des projets. Et ceux-là, c'est passionnant de les accompagner. Et à ce moment-là, il faut des fonds propres. Et donc c'est là où peut-être l'argent peut être investi de manière pertinente, efficace. En tout cas, nous, on y croit. Enfin, je veux dire, on va pas nous tout seuls faire révolutionner tout ça, mais globalement, on pense que dans les infrastructures, il y a beaucoup de choses à faire. Beaucoup de choses à faire. Et on est dans des domaines où, avec les nouvelles technologies, c'est beaucoup moins monopolistique qu'avant. Alors, on a les GAFA, hein, bien sûr, mais tout ça, on peut trouver des contre-exemples à tout. Mais dans le domaine de l'énergie, on est beaucoup plus en décentralisation.
C'est ça.
Par exemple.
Je crois qu'on est quand même presque à la fin du temps disponible. Moi, je vais remercier toutes les personnes qui sont tous les intervenants. Je pense qu'on a quand même, on a été aussi, je pense qu'il y a aussi un esprit assez positif en fait sur comment affronter cette nouvelle crise aussi par rapport à celle de 2007 et 2008. Et je pense que ça c'est très important. Et voilà, je remercie tous les gens qui sont intervenus et je passe en fait la parole à une autre session de Aix en Seine. Merci beaucoup à tous.